introductory spiel. Okay, hopefully we are good to go here. All right, well, good evening, graduate UNSY students. First, just for everyone's awareness, we are recording this session, and a copy is going to be made available for those who are unable to attend it live. Next, for the format of tonight's meeting, I'm going to start by introducing our guest, who's going to discuss his connection to the uncrewed maritime system technology and field. Afterwards, I'm going to lead a series of introductory questions, and then we're going to open up to a class-wide Q&A. I do ask that everyone mute your mics, save any questions to the end, and that you use the hand raise icon to indicate when you do have a question. I'm going to call on each of you in order. And I do ask, have a little patience. I'm trying something new this evening. This is the first time I've held one of these sessions while I've been on the road, so I'm operating it from my phone with my tablet as my prompt. So I'm a little bit technology constrained because of it, but hopefully it doesn't impact or affect anything. So with that, I am super excited to welcome you to the 28th session of the UNSY Guest Speaker Series, the first of 3 for this term. I'm Dr. Brent Terwilliger, the program coordinator for the Master of Science in Uncrewed and Autonomous Systems degree. Tonight, we are joined by our guest subject matter expert, Phillip L. Hoffman. Phillip is leading efforts to expand the use of UMS, or Uncrewed Maritime Systems, for deep ocean exploration at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. He serves as the NOAA R&D lead under the Commercial Engagement Through Ocean Technologies, or CENOTE Act of 2018. He also coordinates joint R&D and operations with the U.S. Navy and is NOAA's R&D liaison to other federal agencies that are conducting uncrewed maritime system work, especially those activities that are taking place in the Gulf of Mexico. Phillip sits in the NOAA UMS Operations Center in Gulfport, Mississippi, and his prior federal service includes leading NOAA's Cooperative Institutes program, as well as work in NOAA Fisheries and with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And with that, I'd like to give a warm welcome to Phillip, and I'll turn the stage over so he can tell us about this rapidly growing technology.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you this evening. I appreciate everybody being willing to take some time to sort of hear the NOAA federal government spiel. As a long time ago course provider in my Army Corps of Engineers days used to say, I am with the federal government and I am here to help you. At least to help you understand how uncrewed maritime systems are currently finding their expression within NOAA. When Brent and I were talking about how we might do this today, he had suggested that there was a wide range of approaches the subject matter experts brought to this particular class. And so with deep apologies to all those of you who work in PowerPoint heavy businesses, I do have a bit of a slideshow that I want to share, but that's because I think the visuals that are in there actually provide you with a real sense of opportunity and a real sense of what it is that we are doing. So hopefully that will be popping up here on the screen sharing in a minute. And as you can see, I'm also a big J.R.R. Tolkien fan. And I do think that there are a lot of things about Tolkien's construction of Middle Earth and the hobbits moving through Middle Earth in a very non-linear fashion that are in fact appropriate for looking at NOAA and the uncrewed maritime systems world. A little bit about my own background. I am old enough to have seen Jacques Cousteau here on the left when he was still alive. I actually saw him in Baton Rouge, the ship Calypso that he sailed for a number of decades, sailed all the way up the Mississippi River. At one point, they docked in Baton Rouge while I was there, and I had the chance to actually see the ship and see him at some distance. But his books, his television show, his other documentaries really got me interested in the ocean and in studying the ocean. And then as a kid, we were visiting some friends of ours in St. Augustine, Florida on the Atlantic coast. And many of you all will be familiar with the fact that the Gulf Stream likes to bring these lovely Portuguese man-of-war in very large schools right by the beach. This, of course, freaked my parents out to no end. They were screaming for my brother and I to get out of the water. And between my nascent interest in Cousteau and the fact that the Portuguese man-of-war had caused my mother to have nearly a heart attack on the beach, my fate was sealed, and I've pretty much been studying the ocean regularly ever since. Academically, I come from a fairly dedicated ocean sciences background. My bachelor's degree is from Eckerd College. And when I graduated in 1992, it was one of only 3 places in the country where you could get an undergraduate degree in marine science. I then came home to Baton Rouge, which is where I grew up, and got my master's degree from Louisiana State University, and also did some summer coursework out at the University of Washington's Friday Harbor Laboratories, which is where I gained the scientific mantra that has guided my career: never gather too much data, you can get in real trouble that way. Having said that, however, I'm going to show you a great many ways in which NOAA is seeking to gather a lot of data. I've gone through a lot of different things in my life. The federal service is there at the bottom of the slide, but the point being that, particularly in the uncrewed maritime systems space, I think there's a lot of opportunity for a lot of people from a lot of different backgrounds to do exciting work. How did NOAA get to the point that we are? Well, like most federal agencies, we've had a bit of a fit and start approach to the use of uncrewed maritime systems. Our first official AUV-related roadmap is now 13 years old. I was very proud at the time, and still am proud, to have been part of the writing team for that roadmap. And it laid out the beginnings of how we're approaching uncrewed maritime systems today. Some of you may be familiar with the UXS strategy that NOAA published in 2021. That strategy has in it pieces that are lifted, if not lock, stock, and barrel from the AUV roadmap. They are definitely able to relate back to that. And if you put both documents side by side and read them side by side, the progression from where the vision was in 2010 to where we are now in 2023. So what does that strategy focus on? Well, it has 5 goals. I won't read them out to you here, but the idea is that uncrewed maritime systems inside NOAA are really now robust enough to take over a number of our at-sea operational mission sets. And so what we have to do is we have to get our organizational structure, our acquisition activity, and our at-sea operations in line with the capabilities that the technology brings us. And the uncrewed systems strategy is a corporate mechanism by which we do that through a whole lot of this, which is really kind of the bread and butter of how NOAA operates. The Uncrewed Systems Operations Center in our Office of Marine and Aviation Operations is my physical home, but my actual home is in NOAA's Oceanic and Atmospheric Research line office. And our line offices, if you want to think about it this way, are the operational cylinders of excellence in NOAA. Everybody knows the National Weather Service. Some people know the National Marine Fisheries Service. Fewer people know the National Ocean Service, though if you are a sailor or boater, you use the official navigational charts produced by NOS. If you've ever been to one of our marine sanctuaries, you also are at a place run by the National Ocean Service. And then NESDIS, which is the National Environmental Satellite Data and Information Service, is where we take the terabytes of data that come from satellites, from uncrewed maritime systems, from fisheries research, and put them all into a place where they can be used by scientists and by members of the public. The screen that I have here is really a diagram of how different missions under the different line offices relate to the use of uncrewed maritime systems. You'll see that the Office of Marine and Aviation Operations here on the center left is kind of the nexus of much of this. And this makes sense because they are the people who fly our aircraft and run our ships. OMAO is an interesting organization. It houses the smallest uniformed service in the United States government. Currently 321 commissioned officers in a rank structure borrowed from the United States Navy. Our hurricane hunters sit there and, of course, work with the U.S. Air Force's hurricane hunters at Keesler Air Force Base here in Mississippi. I am over here in the box in the middle right in the Office of Oceanic and Atmospheric Research. And really our job basically is to be ahead of the research needs and the operational data collection needs of the other line offices, and to be engaged in the development of technology that gets them what they're after 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, etc. And so you can figure out pretty quickly that if you're in the research line office and you're trying to stay ahead of what the other line offices need, your access to and promotion of uncrewed systems becomes fairly critical. Some examples of operations for us include the use of uncrewed systems, both airborne and marine, to improve hurricane forecasting. This is an effort that's been going on for a number of years, and not only are we engaged in the use of ever smaller uncrewed aircraft systems to try and actually penetrate hurricanes at altitude, but we have been in position using buoyancy gliders since about 2014, sailing along various lines that you see here in this diagram in the lower left to try and get ahead of where hurricanes go. And the buoyancy gliders have been after a very specific piece of environmental information, which we call the heat content of the ocean. And that is because heat content has been believed for a number of decades to drive hurricane intensity, and the transfer of heat content between the liquid ocean and the atmosphere above across the air-sea interface is believed to be a significant driver in the speed with which a hurricane intensifies or breaks apart. And it's also believed to be a significant driver for maintaining a hurricane's forward motion. As you might imagine, however, if you look at this picture taken by sail drone inside a Category 4 hurricane a couple of years ago, it's really tough to get a research vessel with human beings on it at the air-sea interface when a Cat 4 or Cat 3 or Cat 2 is going over it. Commercial captains, professional mariners, our officers are trained to flee storms like this in large research vessels. And so thanks to uncrewed systems, we're able to begin to get at that data and really make a difference in hurricane forecast intensity, which is the area where we believe we can make the most improvement most quickly at the moment. We're doing a lot of work with uncrewed maritime systems for nautical charting, for hydrographic survey, and for underwater habitat characterization. Number of different craft, a number of different platforms, but the takeaway from this particular slide is that when you look at uncrewed maritime systems from an operational perspective, this is really where NOAA is investing the most of its dollars at the moment. And when we get to the Q&A, I'm happy to talk about any of the vessels that you see on here. The gray-hulled boat that's in kind of the lower middle right-hand side is a hydrographic survey launch that would deploy normally from one of NOAA's larger hydrographic survey vessels. Each of those vessels, like the Thomas Jefferson or the Rainier, will carry 4 of these HSLs, and they're the ones that really do sort of the side channel surveys and go in shallower water where the big boat can't go. But they have a problem because human crew on those boats can't be out there for forever. And so one of the many ways that we looked at incorporating autonomous technology into what we're doing with mapping and charting is actually converting a number of these launches to be optionally crewed, which means we put autonomy in a box on the launch. We can put the launch back in the water and it can continue to survey without humans being aboard. We're doing a lot more work with these systems looking at fisheries. Again, from a variety of habitat characterization activities, like you see here in the center bottom, where we're looking at the overlap between wind farm development that BOEM is supervising and scallop surveys in the mid and North Atlantic. We're looking at population surveys in untrawlable habitat. This is particularly important in the Gulf of Mexico, looking at reef fish habitats, because the traditional way to determine how many fish that can be harvested in a given fishing season is to drag a big net through the water, to count them, to look at the age distribution, to look at the reproductive maturity distribution, and then make a recommendation to a fisheries management council. Well, anybody who's ever drug a net over a hard reef or a hard bottom or relic oyster shells knows that you're most likely to come up with a shredded net and not any kind of fisheries data. And so using uncrewed systems to address those populations, that habitat structure is becoming critically important for us. We've talked also in NOAA about different ways to use uncrewed systems for the climate missions that we are increasingly being tasked with, both by other federal agencies and by Congress. And so long-range USVs like sail drone are becoming critically important to us in addressing climate trends, because again, you can take a sail drone, you can outfit it with a variety of pieces of instrumentation, a little bit of edge processing on board. You can send it to sea for 4 or 5 months. It doesn't need to be refueled. It doesn't need to be reprovisioned. It doesn't care if there's ice cream in the ice cream locker. Scientific parties aboard vessels, however, care very much if there is ice cream in the ice cream locker, and the lack of ice cream or running out of ice cream before a leg is over is a morale issue. We're also beginning to look at the use of high altitude UAS, the Horus balloon-based ascent concept that you see there on the left-hand side of the screen is being tested by our lab in Boulder, Colorado. It's shown some really, really interesting data and some really tremendous promise for taking upper atmosphere climate readings in a routine fashion, which would be really, really tough to do with aircraft that have human pilots in it. We're doing a lot of surveys of storm damage. You can see here on the right-hand side, some airborne surveys that we've done after floods, and in the lower right-hand side after tornadoes. This allows the National Weather Service to more quickly determine what it is that has actually impacted the ground in a given area. And in the maritime environment, we've done 2 years worth of surveys off the California coast with our partners at the Scripps Institute of Oceanography, trying to find DDT dump sites. These are areas that were permitted by the federal government in the 1950s and 60s, where, as you can see from the photo, barrels of DDT were dumped. Obviously, those barrels are going to break down. They're going to leach a really, really horrible pollutant into the environment. The state of California asked us to reacquire these locations for them using uncrewed systems, and then to begin to try to figure out how to remediate these systems at depth. Brent mentioned I do a lot of work with the Navy, and it should come as no surprise that, particularly in terms of meteorology and operational oceanography, NOAA and the Navy have very similar missions. And so it made sense when Congress passed the C-Note Act in 2018, which was signed in December of that year, for NOAA and the Navy to engage in greater operational activity, greater acquisition activity, greater training, and greater joint deployments. The big challenge to this, bluntly, is that the Navy is not very comfortable operating inside the United States exclusive economic zone. This is an area that they have traditionally avoided, except when they are in transit or for testing of new systems. NOAA, on the other hand, very rarely does work outside of the US EEZ, with the exception of NOAA Ocean Exploration, which is the program that I sit in. Nonetheless, we deploy buoyancy gliders together. The Navy, of course, has an interest in hurricane forecast work. And so if you think back a couple of slides ago to the slide that I showed regarding our buoyancy glider picket lines and the work on hurricane forecast intensity, the Navy has supplied gliders, and they have supplied operational watch standards to assist us with that. We've done a lot of joint development on hydrographic survey platforms, and whenever one or the other organization begins testing a new ASV or a UV for hydrographic survey, we bring the other one along so that they can see the initial test, they can see the initial in water, they get a look at the initial data. In the Navy's case, they do that work in a manner that's unclassified, and so it's very easy for us to do that. There's also a lot of data sharing going on. Those of you that are looking at machine learning and artificial intelligence are very aware, likely, of the fact that if you want to build a new machine learning algorithm to determine where methane seeps are in the bottom of the ocean, you have to have a data set that can train that machine learning algorithm. If you want to have a machine learning algorithm that can tell you the best depth at which to hide between thermoclines, and you're, say, want to hide something that's 250 or 300 feet long, and it's made out of metal, and it makes noise underwater, and it's kind of tube-shaped, you need data sets to train your AI on when you're doing that. NOAA has geographically larger and temporally longer data sets for many of those needs than the Navy retains. And so we work with the Navy by sharing data with them to train their AI and their ML. At the same time, when they can, they do share habitat characterization data with us, particularly in areas where there is submerged underwater cultural heritage. So think naval battles in the Western Pacific, for instance. We do a lot of data sharing. And then under technical collaboration and Antex exercises, these are just ways for NOAA and the Navy to jointly go out to industry and say, hey, here's the technology, here's the sensor platform combination we're interested in, both agencies looking at. You, industry, please come to us and tell us what you can give, what might be our opportunities, what might be our challenges. NOAA Ocean Exploration as a federal program has been around 21 years. We are congressionally authorized to explore, map, and characterize the deep portions of the United States exclusive economic zone, but we cannot possibly do it by ourselves. We have one dedicated 209-foot vessel that we use for this activity. It's currently working in the Aleutian Islands for the rest of the summer. It will do an overwinter in Portland, and then it will be headed out to the Western Pacific for the next 2 years to work out there. And so one of the ways we've addressed that is with a NOAA Ocean Exploration Cooperative Institute. This is a competitive federal grant cooperative agreement scheme that NOAA has been using pretty much since our inception. And the Ocean Exploration CI was established by an open competition. You can see the 5 member institutions on the right-hand side of the slide there. And we use the CIs for rapid research, development, testing activities, for a feedback mechanism where their experts can come in from the university setting to the federal government and say, hey guys, maybe you need to think about doing something different than what you're doing now. And because universities and industry partner in ways that NOAA and industry traditionally do not, we have the ability to leverage industry partnerships to get sometimes a first look or a very early look at a new emerging technology that's coming in from industry, but do it alongside really seasoned oceanographers, really seasoned maritime engineers, particularly our friends from the University of New Hampshire and from Woods Hole, and then go see and test those things and see which of our missions they can meet. We have a lot of other partners outside of the Cooperative Institute. You can see many of them written here, but for ocean exploration's purposes, this is by no means all of the groups that we work with. And in a number of cases, our partnership with the private sector entities that you see on here and with the 501c3s like Smith Ocean has really been about getting technology into the water to meet a no emission need that we can't do elsewise. Ship time is expensive. Owning and operating your own oceanographic research vessel is expensive. It's roughly $25,000 a day in operations costs, plus the salaries of the people on board. And so when we can partner with somebody like OceanX, we can partner with somebody like Vulcan, we can partner with somebody like Ocean Infinity, and have them conduct oceanographic research for us with these platforms, and particularly with the deep Hugens that you see there on the right-hand side. It allows us to meet the mission that Congress has given us, but in ways that spread the expertise around and spread the opportunity around. Our mission in ocean exploration is really simple. We want to contribute first to the development of the next generation of ocean explorers, and those of you that are seeking this master's degree would certainly fall into that category. We want to engage with ocean science communities to talk about technology, to talk about exploration goals. And so before we send our ship out to do a field season somewhere, we'll sometimes take between 6 months and a year talking to local experts, local universities, local private sector entities to figure out what deep ocean interests they have in a particular area. And then, of course, we want to provide technological guidance both in our own office and other parts of NOAA that may be working in the open ocean or the deep ocean, because we are really working in water that is deeper than 250 meters. And if you've ever seen a map of the US EEZ that's been overlaid with any kind of bathymetry, you begin to realize that that's an awful lot of water that we cover. We are continuing to expand our use of technologies in the deep ocean. The reality of the matter is, if you want to go down to the bottom, 6,000 meters, 8,000 meters, 10,000 meters, putting humans down there is next to impossible. There's some news stories recently that kind of highlight that next to impossibility. But what that has driven us to do is really invest a whole lot in technology, not so much from the standpoint of we want to buy it, but from the standpoint of we want to help it exist in the world so that when we need it, we can use it. When others need it, they can use it. This is our ship, the NOAA vessel Oceanus Explorer, 224 feet in length. She is a lovely big ship and was the U.S. Navy ship capable. Under their Tiagos program a number of years ago, we bought her as a stripped bare hull. They did not even leave us the wire. And we built her out to the configuration that you see her there now. We do a lot of work around the world on the Oceanus Explorer. This is our ROV in the upper right-hand side. It is 6,500 meters depth rated. It's called Deep Discoverer. It's actually a two-body ROV system. There's a camera and heave sled attached to it that's kind of hiding here in the lower left corner of that picture, called Sirius. And they are operated for us by the Global Foundation for Ocean Exploration, or GFOE, who've got a number of experts in the ability to run this kind of deep technology. As you might have gathered up to this point, we do an awful lot of uncrewed maritime systems work. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on each of these particular platforms, but all of the platforms you see here either are or very recently have been currently in use by OE or our partners in various research missions in the US EDZ and around the world. And a number of them have been platforms that we've taken north. And I mentioned earlier, we're working in the Aleutians this summer. And so the NOAA platform, Renarian Under Ice, which is this orange one up here in the upper right-hand side, is actually designed to go under ice sheets. Easier to test when you're farther north than when you're farther south. And I'll be happy to answer questions about any of these. I realize time's running on, so we're going to try to move through here. I think we will skip the movie for now, but I will point out that NOAA Ocean Exploration at our oceanexplorer.noaa.gov website that you see there at the bottom of the slide, we have a lot of videos from our cruises. We have a lot of imagery, and we have the ability through that website to access NOAA's data. And the thing I will leave you with is this. We're doing an awful lot of work with a lot of cutting edge systems to collect an awful lot of data. And at the end of the day, if you as the federal taxpayer are not able to access that data and put it to your own research uses, put it to your own proprietary private sector uses, we haven't actually completed our mission, because no matter how good the technology is, our mission at NOAA Ocean Exploration is to give that data to you all so that you can do the next most amazing thing with it. And so with that, I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and hopefully the computer comes back up, and I will happily sit here and answer questions until we run out of questions or until the caffeine from my mid-afternoon coffee wears off.
Outstanding. So, Phillip, I'll lead in with a couple questions, if that's all right. So you mentioned that there are a number of opportunities for folks across really a varied series of backgrounds. What are some of the interesting and unique multidisciplinary connections that you're seeing within the UNSY, that's the uncrewed system, as well as the maritime world?
So the maritime side of the house is very different than the aircraft side of the house, in part because we don't have regulation yet. If you want to fly a drone in the United States, you have to have a Part 107 certification from the FAA if you intend to go above 400 feet. And my apologies to anybody on the call that's had to endure any of that. In the maritime side of the house, we don't have that yet. And so what you see is a lot of folks from significantly varied backgrounds who, like myself, develop a passion for this stuff, jump into it, and go forward from a career standpoint. My training is in traditional fisheries oceanography. And there was a time when I could legitimately go to a high school class and they'd ask me, what's the 10-second summary of your job? And I would say, I get paid to go find things that I like to eat. In a certain respect, the deep ocean exploration work I'm doing now with uncrewed maritime systems is getting paid to go find things that look like things that I want to eat. But I'm not an engineer. I've had to learn a lot of that, but I'm not an engineer. I'm not a buoyancy glider pilot. And there's a lot of overlap between buoyancy glider pilots and ROV pilots. And so if you have ROV piloting in your background, chances are pretty good you could get into that buoyancy space. The Mississippi Gulf Coast Community College, which is one of our two community colleges down here, has a new Associates of Science degree in uncrewed systems. And I've been working with that class as they've been going through. They just finished up here about 2 weeks ago. It's a 2-year course, as you might imagine. And there is everybody you can think of in that class. There's a kid who started in that straight out of high school, 18 years old, no job experience, no idea what he wanted to do with himself. He's probably going to end up being one of the best power systems engineers out there, what he's done with all the rest of the schooling that he wants to take, right? There's a guy in the class who is a police officer. He's about to hit mandatory retirement age as a police officer for the agency that he works for. And so he's trying to figure out how to use uncrewed systems, both airborne and maritime, to engage in crime scene artifact searches. in difficult to reach places. There's a whole broad swath of expertise that's coming into the uncrewed maritime system space. And to me, that is probably the best way to grow the industry, because nobody's stovepiped, nobody's blinded, nobody really has any idea of what this can be or what this should be. And so everybody's coming at it from a different angle. And while that approach persists, I think we will see a much better growth pattern for the maritime side of the house. At some point, the Coast Guard is going to make us get captain's licenses for these things the same way you have for anything else. And at that point, it's going to, we're going to look like the maritime version of the FAA thing. Hopefully, I'll be retired by then.
How do you see collaborative teaming among crewed, uncrewed, and even you mentioned optionally piloted assets, as well as the personnel? How do you see those affecting future maritime exploration, research, and technology development?
I think it's going to remain an integral part of how we do this. The simple truth is we are not yet at a space where there are a lot of non-military, beyond visual line of sight / over the horizon
recording in progress
systems, and there are very few long-range subsurface assets that can go weeks to months. Right, the Kongsberg Hugin that I showed some pictures of in there. Everybody in the business loves the Hugin, but depending on its sensor packages and the depth you're operating at, the max dwell time you can get at 6,000 meters, which is what the Hugin's rated for, is about 70 hours. If you have a longer duration mission than that, you have to team it with other kinds of platforms. You have to team it with, human operators on the surface that can recover it, service it, redeploy it. And at the same time, because we see a lot of growth in machine learning and AI aspects, both for processing the data when it gets to shore, but also for edge processing on the platforms, having computer engineers on the team is becoming even more critical than it would have been just a couple of years ago. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity for continued teaming. And I think there remain opportunities for folks who are in straight up ocean disciplines to make significant contributions to the growth of the industry and to the growth of what we're able to do with these platforms.
Excellent. Yeah, it's exciting to see the potential and the possibility, and just some of the technological breakthroughs that we see happening, how that's affecting and influencing both design as well as the use cases. And that's one of the things this course is very much focused on, is the application or the use cases associated with the evolving technology. In the R&D side, you employ a variety of tools to investigate and convey details of advanced tech. Do you mind walking us through your process from ideation to long-term incorporation of new tools, such as simulation or any kind of analysis software that you use in your personal toolkit?
Sure. So a number of years ago, NOAA adopted a technological readiness, or TRL, structure that's very similar to what you find in the Navy or NASA for high-tech development. And this has sort of become the way that we bin things, right? The good ideas, the stuff where somebody's writing something on the back of a beverage napkin that eventually gets converted to a CAD drawing that eventually comes out of a 3D printer or a Tormach putter of some kind. That sort of TRL 1 to 4 kind of real research stuff. NOAA has federal labs with people that do that. We also have, of course, university partners that provide those services for us. And that is a very collaborative space, because a lot of the work that we do and a lot of the work that we fund in that area comes from somebody at sea saying, I need to do X. And I can't do X with what I have access to currently. And that'll get to me, and I'll turn around to the folks at UNH. I'll turn around to the folks in our lab in Miami. I'll turn around to the folks in our lab in Seattle. And we'll have a sort of a virtual huddle and say, okay, this person needs this thing. We can't get there from where we are. How do we overcome that? And usually the lab folks and the university folks can kind of take it at that point and run with it for a while. And I just sort of get the joy of sitting back and watch really smart people work. If I tried to figure that out, my hair would go completely white, and it's progressing that, very quickly down that particular road. The real evaluation work that I get involved with is a whole lot more about, okay, after somebody has developed the thing to address that particular need, then how do we get that thing to see, first of all? Because you can run 1,000 engineering simulations on the computer, and most of the good maritime engineering programs, that's the first thing they teach you is how to simulate this stuff in a computer environment. You can do a certain amount of sea trials next to your dock. And a lot of people, I think, are beginning to get more familiar with that approach, because pretty much every company that has an AUV or a USV, they do that. They talk about it on their website. They talk about it on the LinkedIn profile. They have it on the YouTube channel. You can find that data out there. But really getting it into the open ocean, getting it on the back deck of a large ship, and seeing not only does it function the way that it's supposed to, but does it function with the systems that are on that ship. There's a critical aspect of that. And we have some internal rubrics that we use, which I'm hesitant to share only because they end up in contracting language at various points, and we're not supposed to put that stuff out because it might predispose somebody to, do something that the lawyers would not like. But we go through the internal rubrics, and we are able to tell fairly easily what's the stuff that's ready for prime time. And then we have other funding mechanisms that we can use, either to take something that the university and NOAA have jointly developed and shift it to the private sector for commercialization. I mentioned sail drone a lot in presentations, and you saw some sail drones in here. And part of the reason for that is that our office has a little bit of point of pride with sail drone, that we were the office that gave them the seed money to develop their first platforms. That's not to say sail drone would not have come into existence without NOAA ocean exploration, but we've had a big hand in what they've been doing all along. And so, what you see in the sail drone fleet, that started on the back of a beverage napkin, but somebody came to us with that beverage napkin and said, hey, this is a really good idea. And we said, yeah, this is a really good idea. Let's partner together and make that happen. For me, as an oceanographer, I have had to learn to trust the engineers. And at the end of the day, if I have an engineer who is a fee, and there goes the beagle, because some guys are walking by in the street. If we're sailing and the engineers look at the system, at either from the telemetry of the system or when it actually gets back on the deck, and they say, this does not work to meet the mission for which it was engineered, and here is why, I have to trust those guys that they're telling me the truth. And generally speaking, they're spot on with their assessments. There is not yet an industry standard for a lot of this stuff, even in the ROV side of the house, which has about a 10-year head start on AUVs and ASVs. There's not an industry standard for that either. It's really an individualized platform sensor combination analysis of fit for purpose or fit for mission.
Excellent. Well, now I want to open this up to any Q&A from the class. Folks, if you want to just raise your hand, I'll try to call on you in order. Looks like Austin is going to lead the charge here. So go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Can you hear me all right?
Yep, loud and clear.
Hi, Phillip. My name is Austin. Nice to meet you. So over your entire career, what would you say is one of the most biggest challenges you have faced with using uncrewed maritime systems for deep sea exploration, and was public perception ever a challenge for your organization?
So there's really two different questions in there. The biggest challenge for using uncrewed systems in deep ocean exploration, quite frankly, is the engineering of pressure hulls to go to depth and then come back. That has a whole series of other challenges embedded in it, one of which is what I call the power problem, which is in my wild fever dreams of how we assess the bottom of the deep ocean using uncrewed systems, I want something that can go to 6,000 meters, map to a couple centimeters of resolution, and do it for 6 months. The only way you're going to get there is if somebody gives me a nuclear reactor that's about this big that I can stuff into one of these things. Because right now, current battery technology and current ocean power technology simply doesn't allow us to do that. And so the Hugiens that I mentioned earlier, you get about 70 hours of dwell time on them, and they're considered long range for deep ocean craft. There are maybe a half dozen 6,000 meter rated AUVs that exist commercially in the world that you can do. And so that's really the biggest challenge, is how do you address the engineering piece? Of all of those, aside from the pressure housing itself, the power problem is the biggest thing in uncrewed maritime systems, period, bar none. You have to either be able to add more power, or you have to be able to be satisfied with a limited number of sensors that return you data of a limited amount of precision. And you have to have a way to either store that data in very small formats or offload that data repeatedly. And communication stuff takes a tremendous amount of power as well. At least with the systems that submerge, we have not yet had to have a discussion with the Coast Guard about whether or not those have to carry things like AIS and cameras to avoid collisions and everything else. But with the stuff that stays on the surface, there is an increasing drive, even though we don't actually have best practices, much less regulations from the Coast Guard. There's still an increasing drive to make them function more like ships. And every time we have that conversation with the Coast Guard, I have to remind them that I need power to do those things. And they're taking away power from my nav system. They're taking away power from my environmental sensors. And they're cutting down the amount of time I can stay at sea. The perception issue is fascinating because NOAA, as a federal agency, we're not supposed to lobby. We're not really allowed to do anything other than public education. But if you look at NASA, particularly in the 60s and 70s, they managed through outstanding public education to secure a legacy in America's imagination of things that NASA does, right? NOAA is way behind that curve. It's a corporate problem, but it certainly impacts how we look at the deep sea, because it is still difficult to find people who want to become ocean engineers and work on solving my power problem for me for an AUV to consider 6,000 meters for 6 months.
Thank you, sir.
I'll also try to be quicker with my other answers.
David, you're up next.
Hey there. Thanks for being with us today. I really appreciate it. My question was, you mentioned that, your mission is to, or one of your missions is to collect data for public sector, private sector, commercial applications for those folks to use. I'm not as familiar with the maritime field, so I was wondering if you could give some examples of any type of commercial applications that utilize that data that you all collect.
Sure. One of the easiest ones, of course, is navigational charts. And we're in a day and age where if you sail or you run motorboats or you run fishing charters, the navigational charts that you now use are electronic in some fashion. They're not the paper charts that I started out with when I was a kid. But NOAA has been given the responsibility of being essentially the hydrographer of the nation, meaning that we produce navigational charts. We've been doing that for well over 100 years. And so taking detailed bathymetry, particularly for shipping channels, for approaches to major ports, that's a significant ongoing mission that we have where we're starting to use a lot of this technology. We also have a mission that aligns with that to open ports up after hurricanes or other natural disasters. And so you've just seen a hurricane go into Southern California, which is meteorologically unusual. There's a team down there conducting surveys. It's been down there for a couple of days now, conducting surveys to make sure that the approaches to the ports of Oakland, Los Angeles, and San Diego don't have any big things in them that weren't there before the storm, so that all of those ships can start coming back into those facilities. And so that's another thing that we do. And then just taking general environmental data, condition of the ocean kind of stuff. Weather prediction actually relies on a fair amount of oceanographic data, not just for hurricanes, but for other kinds of activities. And so we take a lot of sea surface temperature, we take salinity, we take half dozen other environmental parameters that if you've ever looked at a marine forecast, you've seen data from our systems being incorporated into that.
Thanks, appreciate it. That's really interesting.
All right, Scott, you're up.
All right, so you talked about the mapping of the ocean floor. I guess what we got about 20%, according to an article that I read about that NOAA had. How do you feel like that's going to affect some of your camera sleds and the I believe it's the Sirius. I believe that's what it is, with its high resolution sonar systems. How does that affect the marine life when you actually start pinging out that sonar out into the vast blue ocean. How does that actually affect the marine life around the area? Just kind of curious about that.
So that's a really good question. And you all have probably over the years seen various stories in the popular press about the impacts of sonar that the United States Navy uses, for instance, in some of its training activities, and the relationship between that sonar and whales. NOAA has been a party to almost all of that litigation because of our responsibilities under the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act. Just like sound that we interact with on land, whether it's a rock concert or it's a siren from a fire truck or it's somebody that doesn't have their muffler installed properly on their Ford F-350, different things in the ocean produce sound at different frequencies. And the mapping sonar that we use, whether it's in shallow water or whether it's what we refer to as full ocean depth mapping sonar, runs at a frequency where there's a fair amount of good science that says sonar in that frequency is not physically damaging to marine life. There's probably some avoidance of it, particularly amongst marine mammals, because they are, very much attuned to sound in their environment. But at 6,000 meters, you're dealing with species that, first of all, they're used to not having light. In most cases, they're used to a very low oxygen environment, or they're, in a hydrothermal vent community where sulfur is their principal gas of choice because there's no oxygen there. And the nature of their bodies being able to withstand the pressure of 6,000 meters of seawater over them essentially gives the sound wave the ability to, bounce off of them, and it doesn't seem to impact their behavior one way or the other. We'll have the ROV over the side, and it has its mapping sonar in Sirius, and there's also a piloting sonar, so we can kind of figure out where the ROV is going as it swims off into the depth. And, we've had giant squids and sperm whales swim up to the darn thing and kind of look at it and go, I wonder what this is, then kind of swim off. So it's a funny anecdote, but it is a serious consideration. And any time that an industry partner proposes a new sonar for us, one of the things we actually have to do is go through an environmental evaluation of that sonar under various federal regulations to see if there's a change in impact.
Looks like Drake is up next.
All right. Yeah, thank you for your time. So when you go into a development deployment cycle of a new technology, whether it be a raw material or an entire system, are you going through a user requirement gathering, user acceptance testing, something along those lines that you would see in a pharmaceutical manufacturing pipeline? And then in addition to that, does the lack of regulation or oversight, does it become apparent in the development cycle, such as, for example, when you develop a pharmaceutical manufacturing pipeline of whatever, you have to answer to the FDA. So that process must then be transparent to an additional organization. Does that take place in a development cycle that the NOAA would oversee or fund?
Really interesting set of questions. Parenthetically, I did some time very, very early in my career as a quality control chemist for a pharmaceuticals manufacturer. So I actually have a very passing familiarity with the world that you're describing. So I'm going to try to give it back to you in terms that would be understandable for that. Most of the research and development that we do up to the point in time of deployment, because it's us in combination with our university partners, other than, very broad ocean regulations and the normal sort of Coast Guard operational regulations for at-sea work, there's not a huge regulatory burden for us to meet. Unlike my colleagues at the Office of Naval Research, I don't get to do classified work. And so at the end of the day, everything that I do is pretty much subject to FOIA. It's subject to potential congressional testimony, congressional inquiry. And, our perspective is if you don't want to see it on the front page of the Washington Post, don't do it. Thankfully, when it comes to R&D work, that's not really a huge issue because everybody likes gee whiz gadgeting things, right? That's kind of where we are. The regulatory nexus certainly comes in when we go to deploy, because if we're conducting testing in relatively shallow waters, relatively close to the coast, we do have to advise Coast Guard captain of the port where we are, what our kind of operations are. what the vessel is going to do. Will the vessel, in fact, that we're launching off and retrieving off of, will it have the ability to navigate and maneuver, or is it going to be representing some kind of temporary obstruction that the Coast Guard needs to be aware of? But beyond that, when it comes to materials engineering and that sort of thing, there really isn't a whole lot of regulation in the United States for a lot of that sort of work. And so the regulatory scheme that you see the FDA implementing with various pharmaceutical companies, it doesn't exist in our side of the R&D house. The regulation piece comes in at commercialization and deployment, again, because these are systems that are deployed off of commercially operated vessels. They're produced by existing private sector businesses in some fashion, and all of those folks have certain regulatory schemes that they're responsible to. Frankly, it doesn't slow us down at all. Congress not doing its one constitutionally mandated job slows us down tremendously. But I digress. I'm not supposed to lobby.
All right, looks like Robert is the last hand standing.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Philip, for the talk. Really appreciate it. I had two questions. I hope you don't mind answering them both. The first is around edge processing, which you mentioned a couple of times, I think. I was just wondering about what use cases you would need edge processing for. Obviously, because you wouldn't use that in a purely data collection fashion, you would need that, I assume, when you need it live or that information processed live. So just more around the use cases for that. And then the second question is, obviously, I imagine your work is very US-centric, but further afield, what international cooperation do you do with other agencies and bigger projects that are international, more so than just the US?
So the edge processing case that we're seeing right now is really focused in two areas. One is implementing navigational autonomy on subsurface platforms and giving those subsurface platforms the ability to integrate their inertial navigation system, which almost all of them have some kind of inertial navigation system for subsurface work, giving them the ability to integrate their navigational sonar. And so even a mapping AUV, which has a multi-beam echo sounder for high resolution mapping, will carry a low bandwidth, low resolution side scan sonar to help it navigate ahead through various things that it's looking for. And so that's really sort of one use case of being able to put one of these things over the side, give it its starting point, give it its end point, and then let it determine its course across that space based on the environmental data that it's receiving. The other edge processing activity that we see is really about taking raw data and putting it into a, not necessarily final form, but a form that is several steps further in the QA/QC process. So for right now, if you have an autonomous surface vessel that's engaged in hydrographic survey, all that ASV does is collects the data, and then you offload the data packet at some point. Now, it may be a real-time offload if you're in visual line of sight through a radio transmitter. It may be through Iridium satellite. It may be through some other mechanism, or you may wait until you're done with the survey and then literally plug the thing into your network and download it that way. And so what we're trying to do with edge processing is cut out some of that time and cut out some of those steps so that when the data packet comes off the platform, it's gone from whatever its zeros and ones format is into something that looks like really close to what its final format is, bearing in mind that you're never going to get a processing system on one of these platforms big enough to do the full automated QA/QC. And so you're going to have a human in the loop at the end of that. So that's kind of where we see that. There are, of course, a whole lot of other potential opportunities. Our office has done a lot of 4K video collection over the years and lower resolution video collection prior to the introduction of 4K. And we're now working on machine learning projects to annotate all of that for the organisms that we see in that video. And so the ultimate idea would be that the algorithm would tell you with a certain level of confidence what's the genus and species of every organism that comes through 8 hours of 4K video. Because while you can pay grad students in pizza and beer to do that annotation for you, that's a very big pizza and beer budget. Or you just have to have really dedicated grad students. With regards to international activities, NOAA, as a federal agency, has bilateral research agreements with a large variety of foreign countries, large variety of multinational research entities. We do a lot of oceanographic research with the Japanese, the Koreans, and the Indonesians. And in fact, we've done home porting work with them. We've done joint vessel deployments with them. We've done some R&D work in terms of developing sensors that are then tested jointly by both organizations in different parts of the ocean. We do a fair amount with the EU and particularly with the United Kingdom. Again, this makes sense because there's a very long-standing history there. And a lot of the conferences that I go to and the professional society activities I engage with, it's not uncommon to have a UK Hydro or UK Met team there, or somebody from the National Ocean Center in the UK who's part of whatever we're getting at. We don't tend to do a lot of work with Mediterranean countries. I'm sure we could if we needed to, but we just haven't. And the area that we see growth now is in capacity building for oceanographic services for small island nations. There's a climate tie-in there, as you might imagine, with sea level rise. There's also a fisheries tie-in there because a lot of small island nations rely on subsistence fishing for major protein sources for their populations. And so we're trying to help out with capacity building in those areas where we can. The challenge for us, bluntly, is we have to go through the U.S. State Department to do a lot of that thing. And so even though NOAA is the lead federal agency for that kind of activity, we're the lead signatory agency on those agreements, we have to engage with the State Department first. And I have to blow up the chat here so I can read Scott's question. Mapping the ocean for enhanced oceanographic navigation. So the problem with GPS, bluntly, is the signal transmitted by GPS coming down from satellites attenuates at depth. As we see GPS advancing, certainly if a system comes to the surface, takes a GPS fix, a lot of that is going to be improved. And as we expand our mapping, when a system then dives, it will have a much better idea of where it is based on that initial position fix. The real interesting development in underwater navigation, and ONR has been working on this for a number of years. There are now private sector companies working on it. The Europeans have been working on it, is in using the Earth's magnetic field for precise underwater navigation. That's just very much in its infancy. The kind of detectors that you have to use, the kind of processing that you have to use, all of that is still very, very much at low technical readiness level development activities, but there's some really fascinating stuff being done in that particular area, because again, that's something that we can sense when we're underwater. And so if we can sense that, we can do it. The other place where I see advances in GPS translating into advances with these systems is that we will sometimes deploy an underwater acoustic network of 4 or 6 or 12 underwater acoustic nodes, if you will, over a very broad location. And between with advances in GPS, we can better dial in where each one of those acoustic nodes is. And so if one of our fish is navigating off of a node network like that, it will increase the resolution of that navigation.
Is that using a self-healing mesh network so that each respective platform can share its orientation and details with the others so that they can then navigate off that as well?
We're getting into that. The maritime side of the house looks at that still as kind of a holy grail of swarm technology, if you will. And again, the problem that we have is that most underwater communication platform to platform is acoustic. And even the highest powered ultra short baseline or USBL acoustic transmitters that you can put on these fish, they only go about 1,000 meters before the signal attenuates and you just can't read it. That said, I've had some very interesting conversations with some of my NASA colleagues who are using lasers to communicate through the Earth's atmosphere for deep space probes, and using laser modems to send signals back and forth to deep space probes. And I keep reminding the NASA guys that the only difference between their engineering problem and my engineering problem is the viscosity coefficient of the fluid through which they are shooting the laser. And they keep telling me that I should really just, take my concerns elsewhere and let them go play with their laser toys. But there may be on something.
I'd like to build off that because that's one of the things that we kept in mind when we established this degree program was that while we're Embry-Riddle, so we're very much aerospace focused. However, we intentfully keep a foot in the maritime, the ground, the space domains for our course content because we do see exactly what you're describing is that interoperability, that opportunity for innovation to occur within the space between, where if you have a solution or even a challenge in one operational domain, there could be a solution to it that comes from another, whether it's technological or even procedural, that we can see, hey, this is occurring over here. We had a guest in regarding the maritime stuff in the past from NASA, or his team was a part of NASA at one point. Now they're a private company, but they had developed a platform for Johnson's neutral buoyancy lab, and they had realized, hey, the technology we're creating and testing in this environment can also be applied to maritime. And a unique facet of it was everything was electrically actuated. It was linear actuators. It was worm drives, screw drives, whatever you want to call them. And the reason that they saw benefit was because of the challenges that you have at hydraulics at depth, whereas the electric driven system, well, it doesn't have that same issue. It has different issues, but it helped to address that pressure differential challenge that occurs. So that is one of the exciting things that I see happening in this field, in this space, is that we can often look to recognize opportunity for innovation and advancement.
The Narrate Under Ice platform that I mentioned when I was going through my slide deck is jointly funded by us and NASA JPL, essentially as a test bed for technologies for under ice exploration on ice exoplanets.
Oh, nice.
and so our Arctic work is serving as their proxy for, okay, we want to shoot this thing 10 million miles into space, 15 million miles into space, punch it through an ice sheet on an ice exoplanet and have it swim around underneath and collect data for us. And it's I will tell you, ocean people and NASA people on the same ship together for long periods of time generates some really interesting conversations. It's also like the most major Big Bang Theory level geekdom you will ever find anywhere. And getting to Devin's question in the chat, we tend to lose platforms to malfunction more so than bad weather, particularly the submersible ones, because if a submersible platform sees bad weather coming, it just dives, lets it go over the top and come back up. We don't lose many of them. And if we can get in contact with them, we will certainly try to pull them out of the water, stick them on the big boat and then run before the weather comes. It gives our property people an interesting kind of apoplexy because they want to put a NOAA property sticker on a thing that costs $1 million that we're going to throw off the back of a research vessel in the middle of the Atlantic. And our expectation is it won't come back because we're throwing it off the back of a research vessel in the middle of the Atlantic. But you do have to think about that. And as to recovery, we have a great network of research vessels around the United States that's run under the auspices of the National Science Foundation. It's called UNOLS. If we lose a platform, but it pops back up and there's a UNOLS vessel, they'll go get it. We'll pick up UNOLS stuff. The Coast Guard picks up our stuff. We pick up Navy stuff. The Navy picks up our stuff. And so there's a whole universe of people who coordinate research vessel operations around the United States and around the world. They're talking to each other constantly about where their boats are. And if somebody loses a fish, but it eventually resurfaces, we'll go and get it back. The only way you can get something off the seafloor after it's sunk is if you have an acoustic pinger and you get there quick enough to know where it is, and you have something that can go down to where it is and attach a cable and pull it back. 9 times out of 10, if it's stuck in the seafloor, particularly if it goes nose cone down in the mud, you're not getting that thing back.
Thank you, Philip.
Well, excellent. Well, on that, I want to say thank you to everybody for joining us tonight for this first UNSY Guest SME session, as well as offer a major thank you to Philip for sharing his thoughts and his expertise regarding this technology. It's been a really informative session, and it helps us to better understand the advancement of uncrewed system technology in the maritime domain. To receive credit for participating in this week's session, you're going to need to develop a brief overview for the Module 3 discussion point that identifies that you are in attendance. Make sure to describe how NOAA is advancing or supporting UNSY maritime technologies or capability. For example, the development of new processes and procedures. Also, make sure to discuss any new information that you were not previously familiar with and how your overall understanding of the topic has improved. I hope to have the recording from this session uploaded to the discussion area and the instructor corner by tomorrow. So with that, I want to say thank you again to everybody. I'll stick around for a couple minutes if anybody has any questions.
And I've dropped my email into the chat box. I can sit around and have these conversations with